70-plus-year-old synagogue that we have the special privilege of sitting in today, and the special privilege of hearing from Corey, who's going to talk to us a bunch about his experience as a lone soldier serving with the IDF in Israel, some of the lessons and takeaways and that he learned while serving there, and that he has since put into a book, which we'll all also have the opportunity to hear about and see more about downstairs after the talk. You know, we find ourselves in an auspicious time of the Jewish calendar for a couple of reasons. We are currently counting the Sphira, the days between Pesach, Passover, and Shavuot. We are leading up this week to Lag BaOmer, the celebratory day, a little bit more than halfway through the Omer. And we know that the reason why many traditional Jews have accustomed to observe the days leading up to Lag BaOmer with some symbols of mourning is because 2,000 plus years ago, 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva passed away in a plague, and we mourn the loss of their Torah. And the Talmud tells us, what was it about these 24,000 students that caused their unfortunate and early demise? And we're told by the rabbis, by our sages, that we lost them because although they were great Torah scholars, although they were great leaders of the Jewish people, they had one fatal flaw. They did not respect one another. They didn't have the appropriate respect, consideration, compassion for their fellow man. And although they had great wealth of Torah knowledge, and although they were great leaders of the community, the fact that they did not know how to treat each other kindly, they did not know how to put the greater community first, but instead kind of held themselves out as the be-all and end-all, the most important person in the room, in the building, in the world, caused, unfortunately, their early deaths. I think today we have the opportunity to celebrate together and to learn from someone who clearly exemplifies the opposite of the thing that we mourn in the weeks leading up to Lag BaOmer. To have the special privilege of hearing from someone who served as a lone soldier in the IDF. A lone soldier means someone who leaves their family, leaves their community, travels to a country that is not their own in pursuit of something greater than themselves, in the spirit of self-sacrifice, understanding and recognizing that there's something bigger than our own individual lives, but there's a community that we're all members of. There's a mission that we all endure together, and we have the opportunity to put and place above our own individual destinies. Corey, I think, is a great example for all of us in that sense, as someone who really thought about what it is that he could do for community, the fact that there is something greater than us all, and put his money where his mouth was, and actually got on a plane, traveled out there, and did it. We celebrate this month both Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim, 2 days where we really recognize the glory of God and God's hand in modern Jewish history. We recognize the part that individuals like Corey, that groups like the IDF, and that Jews all across the world have played in making the modern world, the 20th and 21st century worlds, a world of our own, a world of Jewish mission, a world of Jewish values, a world of Jewish experience. And I think that is another thing that we really celebrate in this month, and that Corey can kind of, in his own unique way, exemplify for us. So I think hopefully my challenge to myself and to all of us as we sit here is to really tap in and listen to what Corey has to say, to listen to and not only experience through his words, understand through his words his experience, but think for ourselves proactively how it is that we can continue the missions that Corey so significantly stands for in our own lives, day to day, from now until the end of time, until when Mashiach comes. So, with that, I would love to welcome Corey up here to the Adereth podium, and looking very forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you so much, Rabbi and Ali, for putting this together. They do not see you dangling there, your gun glistening in the moonlight, your body suspended 18 feet in the air from the end of a rope. It is your 4th trip up using only your hands, and your grip goes weak, threatening to slip. They do not see you in the dead of night, insufficiently clothed and curled up in a ball as protection from the cold. They do not see the sad brown eyes of the girl you told you would see this Friday when you tell her yet again that the Army has made other plans for your weekend. They do not see the pain on your face when a younger sibling remarks, with harmless intent, that you're missing her childhood. They do not see you on the long marches as you struggle through lack of sleep and lack of strength to keep your eyes open and your legs moving forward. They do not see you at 4 a.m. with only a shirt as protection from the whipping wind as you learn how to shoot in close quarters. They do not see you in the push-up position on your knuckles as rocks enter your skin, as you're taught what it means to be strong, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. They do not see you as your vision grows dim from lack of oxygen, as you are pitted against 5 soldiers in hand-to-hand combat training. All this they do not see. And yet when our country is attacked, it is you they will call on to defend them. You may not have slept and you may not have eaten, but they will rely on you to defend their homes. It is you they will turn to ensure that missiles do not fall on their children's schools and buses do not blow up in their cities. They will put their trust in you, in the strength of your legs, and in the accuracy of your gun. And so you must be strong. You must continue to march and ignore the throbbing pain in your knees. You must continue to carry and ignore the aching pain in your back. You must continue to run even when it hurts to walk. You must keep your eyes open and fight the urge to sleep. You must train to be the warrior they expect you to be, even though they do not see. I wrote that in November of 2011, which was 1 year into my IDF training, which I began in a counter-terror unit called Duvdevan. When we finished advanced and basic training at the paratroopers training base, we were on standby for this first session of Krav Maga, which is Israeli self-defense. It was this notorious rite of passage that everyone knew was coming and would be miserable. So finally, one night at 2 a.m, our commander bursts into our room and says, 4 minutes Krav Maga. Everything is a surprise in training. No one ever tells you anything. You know, the terrorist doesn't call up in advance and let you know where he's going to be and when. So by the same logic, you're never told anything, but you're always expected to be exactly on time. So we had 4 minutes to change into the proper gear, grab the team's gear and the equipment, and be ready for this session of Krav Maga. Now that session was around 3 hours. Every time we made a mistake, which was akin to looking in the wrong direction, the punishment was push-ups on our knuckles or just holding that position. And I remember that at the halfway mark, which they obviously didn't tell us was the halfway mark, I went to reach for this water bottle and I realized that I couldn't open my right hand. So I had to use my left hand to open my right fist. Because it was basically shut. So during training I had a number of painful experiences that caused me to ask myself several questions. One was, why did I sign up for this? And the second was, what is it all for? So looking back now with the benefit of time and reflection, I think I've come to understand that a lot of the things that seem to be suffering for suffering's sake were actually lessons in disguise. And I think for me the most impactful lesson of all was resilience, which is this idea that with the proper why, any how becomes possible. My interest in Israel started freshman year of high school in 2002, which was the Intifada, many of you will remember. And at that period, there was a terror attack basically every week in Israel. And there were headlines that were happening in the New York Times and other newspapers that caught my eye. And not just because these were important things to pay attention to, but because of what these headlines said. So under one headline, there was a picture of a bombed out bus, and the headline read, Powell puts off Arafat talk as bomb kills 6. Another headline read, bomb kills 9 in Jerusalem. A third headline read, Israelis killed 17 Palestinians, in Tel Aviv 3 die in shooting. And what was remarkable was when Israelis died, it was never Palestinian terrorists that killed them. It was a bomb that exploded. It would be akin to the ridiculousness of someone drowning someone else and the headline being, water drowns too, right? But when Israelis killed Palestinians, it was always specifically mentioned as such. And I started to notice things like equivalence between suicide bombers and victims.
there was one infamous article that had the headline, "Two girls divided by war joining carnage." And it was a picture of the suicide bomber and her victim next to her. And this was a New York Times article. And the first line of this article was, "The suicide bomber and her victim look strikingly similar." And this audacious article goes on to compare these two women, one of whom was a suicide bomber and one of whom was a victim. A few more headlines. Israelis kill a Palestinian and arrest 25 others. Suicide attackers kill 4 in Israel. Israeli forces kill 5 Palestinians. Bomb kills at least 19 in Israel as Arabs meet over peace plan. Israelis kill 2 Palestinians, raising toll to 30 this week. Suicide bomb kills 16 in Jerusalem. Israel strikes Gaza. These headlines were nearly 20 years ago at this point, and sadly, it's not really gotten much better, neither in newspapers nor in the streets, especially in New York, as I'm sure we can all attest to. I speak for an organization called Reservists on Duty that brings people who do their reserve service to speak on college campuses around the country, around the world, really. And so in November of 2019, we spoke at York University in Canada. We had 20 armed police to protect us from the 600 counter-protesters who came to protest our right to free speech, to express our experiences at a supposedly liberal institution. And these protesters chanted, hey ho, the occupation has got to go. They chanted, viva, viva, intifada. They chanted, 5, 6, 7, 8, Israel is an apartheid state. I spoke to a few of the students during and after this event. One of them told me, I wear a kippah to class and I feel scared for my safety. One told me I had other Jewish friends that wanted to come tonight but didn't want to be labeled as Jewish or sympathetic to Israel. On March 30th in New York City, some of you may be aware that there was a protest against Israel. It's, I guess, pretty common at this point. The protesters chanted, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. There's only one solution, intifada revolution. Of course, a reference to the armed uprising we just discussed that killed thousands of innocent people, Palestinians and Israelis. And I saw a video of the same protest that maybe some of you have seen where they were chanting, we don't want no Jews here. Did anyone else see that video? By show of hands? No, only people that are friends with me on Instagram. So and that's kind of ridiculous that you didn't see that video, right? Because that was happening in New York City. Can you imagine if Jews were chanting that about another group of people, how omnipresent it would be on every source of international media? So according to the FBI, crimes targeting the Jewish community consistently constitute half of all religion-based crimes in the US, despite Jews being 1.8% of America's population. So sadly, the feeling that I had 20 years ago has not really changed. We are singled out all over the world, even in this country, where we're made to feel safe at times because of our religion and our support for Israel. Years before I drafted at a Hanukkah party in the old city of Jerusalem, I heard a rabbi speak about the holiday of Hanukkah. And I expected him to speak about the Maccabees and all sorts of other things related to the holiday, but he only asked a simple question. He said, what would you fight for? Where do you draw the line? For me, for most of my life, I didn't have direct experiences with anti-Semitism. Scarsdale High School was a safe place for a Jew, and I lived in a bubble, quite frankly. But even then, a quick glance through internationally renowned news sources like the New York Times paints a very different picture. So when I finished university in 2010, I moved to Israel and enlisted in the IDF because I decided where I draw the line. When bomb shelters are built in playgrounds, when buses are searched for explosive before entering the central bus station, when schools are closed not because of incoming snow but because of incoming missiles, I felt that I couldn't stand on the sidelines and watch, and I had to do something. So that was my why, and I set my eyes on the top unit in the Army. Unfortunately, having a why is not enough. You also have to speak Hebrew, it turns out. I know, crazy. So I lived on a kibbutz with 30 other kids, 29 of whom had at least one Israeli parent. My dad doesn't speak much Hebrew because he's not Israeli. So I was the only one without an Israeli parent in that group. And so naturally, 29 of them passed the Hebrew exam and I failed it. Which was surprising because I had my Hebrew interview done in a center in Israel, sitting across from this pretty Israeli girl who was my age. And I felt like we had a really strong connection, and I really made it known to her that it was important to me to pass this Hebrew test.
And I think failing that Hebrew test was my first indication that Israeli women are completely immune to American charm. And I would learn this lesson many times over the previous decade and continue to learn it to this day. So I was signed up for Army Ulpan, and I knew that it would severely limit my chances of acceptance into special units. And so I fought this to the best of my ability. I was in Ulpan for 5 hours a day, studying for an additional 2 hours, not easy for someone with ADD. And I was writing to high-ranking officers asking for permission to retake this test. Every time we were on a military base, I would find someone with a lot of brass up here and explain to them my predicament and ask them if I could take this retest. And so eventually, finally, one of these things worked, and I was able to retake this test and pass it, and finally was also accepted into the Special Forces after completing a lot of these pre-tests. And so once I got into the military, obviously the challenges continued. There was an instance that I can recall during our navigation final. Everything that you do in the Army has like a culmination test. So navigation is a 16-week course, and then you have this 1 week kind of final. And I had just been to the doctor because of problems with my knee, who told me that I had a slight tear in my meniscus, and so I approached my officer and said, listen, I'm so sorry, based on this diagnosis, it looks like I'm not going to be able to do the navigation final. And he said, I'm so sorry, sounds like you're going to be redoing the entire navigation course next year if that's what you decide to do. And of course, the underlying unspoken threat was maybe you'll be dropped from training as well. So I hated navigation with all my might and had no intentions of doing it 2 years in a row. And so I did it. I walked an average of 18 miles, carrying 70 pounds on my back, tired, hungry, cold, but more importantly, at some points, unable to bend that leg, just literally dragging it behind me. I was last most nights, coming in long after sunrise. And frankly, my knee still hurts. Someday it will be a good deal for some surgeon that's going to have to redo it. But I think, frankly, it was a good trade because I learned in a firsthand and important way that the preconceived notions we have about what's possible and what's impossible are really false, and the sky's the limit. And that week taught me that when you really want something with all your might, nothing can stand in your way to get it. And so I'm really grateful to the IDF for that lesson, even if it's going to cost me some money in surgery down the line. I want to say a few words about how the book came to be, and then maybe break for some questions. So when I went over to Israel, I started a kind of a newsletter, just emailing friends and family. Eventually that turned into a blog. And eventually that blog was picked up by the Times of Israel, and they gave me kind of my own personal blog. And so as a surprise to me, it started to get like a lot of views and it was shared. So I was like, wow, maybe I should do something with this. So I set out to kind of connect these snapshots, these pictures of specific moments in my service and connect them into a more cohesive story. And that process took many, many years. My father was actually very helpful in the editing phase, so we'll give him some credit while he's here. But the first version of it was probably 2015. And I think what's so funny to me is if you read that version, there's a lot of certainty, there's a lot of wrong and right, there's a lot of black and white. And I think as I've been forced to relive these experiences and read about these experiences through a different, arguably more mature set of eyes, a lot of the things that seemed to be so black and white became gray. So I think the last story I'll tell you is about the last day of my service. We were on a base in Judea and Samaria, and we were responsible for a sector of Judea and Samaria and the fence in between Israel and the Palestinians living there. And we got a call that they had reached the fence. Someone cut a hole in the fence, and there were Palestinians pouring through it, entering Israel. Many of them come in search of work, but of course there's always the threat that some are coming for more sinister reasons. So they send us in our armored vehicle to the fence. The protocol was if you're within a kilometer of the fence, you have to wear an armored helmet, an armored vest, and a gun. This was my last day, and I knew there was no chance I was going to catch anyone in a 30-pound vest, so I left my vest in the car, which I probably wouldn't have done if the Army still had time to punish me, and just took off. At this point, there's probably 10 people left in this field, all running back towards the fence. So it's about a football field, I would say, and by the time I get halfway through it, 10 has become 5. Eventually, with about 100 feet left. There's just me and one other guy. So he keeps turning around to look where I am. He keeps falling. There's a bunch of these kind of sand hills. And when we're about 10 feet from the fence, he falls again. His backpack comes off. He looks and sees that I'm right behind him and kind of does this like horse gallop move where he doesn't really get up, but he's on all fours and just dives through the fence. I dive after him and touch his shoe, but don't manage to grab it. So now we're both sitting there on opposite sides of this fence, panting, and I hear this thunderous applause, and I look up on the hill, and there's hundreds of Palestinians cheering like this guy just stole home. I mean, it was like a baseball game. So I walk over to his backpack, I open it. It was a Hello Kitty backpack, by the way, and it had a bunch of clothes in it. So as I imagined, he was going in search of work. So I picked it up, I walked towards the fence. Again, his eyes grow wide. He's probably thinking, is this guy crazy enough to come across the fence? And I tossed him his backpack and said, nice run. And that was my final interaction with a Palestinian in my IDF service. And, of course I could tell you stories about rocks thrown at my head and riots and missiles. And I think those are kind of the obvious parts of combat service in the IDF. But maybe what's not as obvious is the impossible situation that soldiers often find themselves in. I was a year in training for a counter-terror unit, 6 months of training for reconnaissance infantry, and then 99% of the time I was put into situations that called for extreme amounts of restraint. And I think a lot of the situations that IDF soldiers are put in even today would be difficult for career soldiers, let alone 20-year-olds who are a year or less out of high school. Many of my friends in the IDF lost their friends and family in the Intifada. The first or maybe second week of basic training, you have kind of like values training. So you're brought to a base and you're taught about the values of the IDF, and they ask you questions. Walk over there if you believe that X or Y. So one of the questions was, walk over there if you believe that peace is possible with the Palestinians. The only two people that walked over there were me and another guy that was born outside of Israel. None of the Israelis moved. And I think that's pretty telling. And so I do believe that the IDF is the most moral army in the world. I also believe that crimes are committed by IDF soldiers. I also think that the average IDF soldier is far less likely than his or her peers in any other military in the world to follow an immoral order or intentionally target a civilian. So I'm very proud of having had the opportunity to serve in the IDF, as well as to continue to serve in the reserves. I'm grateful to you all for coming to listen to my story. And I'll just say that I think, as Jews in America, we have an obligation to step up and defend Israel, which happens for all of us in different ways. As an example of something that you might want to do, you might want to mention to your kids, there's two organizations that I help to run and run respectively that teach young Jews how to defend Israel in the media, in social settings. We teach them about things like, occupation, BDS, all these claims that are often levied against Israel. And the second is an organization that teaches Jews how to physically defend themselves against threats. So we can talk more about those after, but I wanted to make sure I left time for questions. So thank you again for coming to listen.
Do you maintain any ongoing relationships with any of the other IDF people that you served with?
Yeah, certainly. So I do my reserves every year with the same group of guys that I served with, coming on 10 years now. I was back there a month and a half ago for one of their weddings. So it cost me a lot of points, but I do my best to maintain relationships where I can. And some of them live here now, actually. Yep.
And what are the two organizations? I didn't get the
Sorry,
name.
the first one is called Fuel for Truth,
Fuel for Truth?
and the second is called Legion. Legion.
R-E-G-I-O?
L-E-G-I-O-N.
Oh, okay.
I think actually the former president of Adereth, who's now our esteemed treasurer, helped found Fuel for
Oh, amazing.
Yeah,
What's his name?
His name is Seth Gilston.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's funny. Wow, okay. Small world, huh?
It's a very, very small world. He's in LA, otherwise he would
Yeah,
obviously be here today.
ADD, how did this hinder you? How did you manage it? Must have been a challenge during this meeting.
Which thing?
ADD.
Oh, ADD. It's funny, actually. I was on like 72 milligrams of Concerta for most of my life, and then senior year of college realized that, you can't really be on controlled substances in the Army, so I went off it, and it was really hard. I mean, I was taking 2 classes instead of 4, but I feel like I would read the same piece of paper like 10 times and not absorb any of it. You know, I think it's like anything else. Like, you know, I don't know, 100 years ago, no one knew what ADHD was. People probably had it, and when you had something in front of you that you had to focus on, you figured it out. Like, I'm sure there were soldiers on guard duty who were more attentive than I was, but I guess I did well enough to to pass the bar. You know, I think the thing about ADD is when something's not important, you can be distracted, but when it's life and death, you have the same focus as anyone else. So when the situation calls for it, you certainly can muster that up. And by the time I was an operational combat soldier, I'd been off medication fully for, you know, over 2 years, and kind of learned to compensate to whatever extent it's possible to do that. But that's a fair question.
Can you describe how you had your training with Krav Maga, how effective it is, if you had it in any type of fight with an enemy combatant? Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I think the IDF's Krav Maga and civilian Krav Maga are fairly different. In the IDF, it's more aggression training. You know, they want to change you over from kind of scared teenagers to someone that will run through a wall to capture to free your teammate if they get captured. If you think about some of these stories about soldiers that are kidnapped, you know, one disappears, like they want you running through a wall to find that soldier. And so a lot of the Krav Maga was kind of geared towards like flipping that switch. Form was stressed, kind of, but not as much as kind of pure aggression. You know, you have a gun, so you can theoretically use that. In civilian Krav Maga, which Jared and I have taken, you know, you don't have a weapon, and potentially the person that you're fighting does have a weapon. So there's a lot more. It's a lot more about form. It's a lot more about repetition, and of course, it's still that aggressive. It's still that aggressiveness that the IDF trains. Krav Maga was actually originated in the, what do you call them, like the ghettos prior to World War II. Lichtenstein, was that? Emi Lichtenstein was teaching Jews how to defend themselves, basically, and that he then moved to Israel and trained the pre-army organizations, and eventually this became the official martial arts of the IDF, that being Krav Maga. So it's evolved a lot, and New York actually has a number of schools that are kind of accredited Krav Maga schools. And it's a little different, and it's a little similar.
Does Krav Maga make you feel more confident when you walk into some neighborhood?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, definitely. I also think, you know, people, whether they're good people or bad people, are perceptive, particularly if you're going to commit crime. Like, you're looking around, right? And you don't have to be faster than the bear, right? You have to be faster than your friend. And there's an air that I think someone who knows how to defend themselves gives off that's different from someone who doesn't. And I think, you know, I haven't seen the data on this, but I would imagine that people who are trained in martial arts are attacked less because they give off an energy that says, like, I know what I'm doing. They're looking around. They're just less likely to be taken by surprise because violence is not completely absent from their world and their mind, right? They are taught to kind of think about it, to train in it. So, you know, it's something that I definitely recommend for Jews in the hopes that you never need it. Maybe even just as a means of deterrence, or to have the confidence to walk with your chin up in areas where that will be perceived as someone they don't want to mess with, you know. Any more questions?
I have 2 questions.
Sure.
First is a little bit about your story, and I'm sure when I finish the book I'll know more. But did you ever consider continuing kind of in the IDF into maybe some form of administrative role or officer role or anything like that kind of after your service? And the second is, and I'm sure we're all interested in this, how do you find you develop kind of your very, very impassioned and articulate speaking style? You're clearly very comfortable in front of a crowd. I think I'm learning a lot just from listening to this. I think it's very impressive to see. I'd be interested to hear kind of how that came about.
Like, when you bring half the crowd, it's a lot less priceless.
That's my goal pretty much.
Yeah. So, you know, my goal was definitely to be an officer from the start, but it's hard enough to follow in a language you don't fully speak, let alone lead. And so that was really like one of the most frustrating parts, I think, of the IDF for me was, you know, I've been at a university, I'd held leadership roles in different organizations, and now I come in here and I have like the speaking and comprehension of a 5th grader, and Israelis are, you know, a little pushy, and so if you can't speak quickly and convey yourself, you're kind of left on the side. So it definitely impacted me psychologically, I would say, but it was something that I always wanted. And you know, if I had entered the IDF now with the Hebrew that I have, you know, maybe I would have continued. I don't think I had any desire to remain in an administrative role. Like after you've kind of done the combat role, you know, it's it would be hard to kind of look at anything else. And frankly, you know, I have friends now who during, you know, since we got out, have hurt their knees, have hurt their back. So when we do reserves, they can't train with us. They can't go on missions. They prepare the food. I think that's so much harder than anything we do. I mean, to just seriously, like to show up and take time out of your life and spend 12 hours a day in the kitchen, you know, is remarkable. So, you know, I have all the respect in the world for people that are willing to put their egos on the side and you know, do the things that need to get done. But at 26, that definitely wasn't my mentality. So, yeah, I mean, it was a dream, but an unrealized one. And regarding speaking, you know, I guess like I'm in sales, so I have to speak a lot for work. I learned a new language for one of my companies and had to pitch in a foreign language, and that was really nerve-wracking. So I think after that, you know, anything is kind of a little bit easier. But just like anything else, you do it enough, you get better at it. You know, I'll ask them after what I could have done better. So maybe that's something like whenever you speak, if you have someone you trust, be like, hey, what could be better for next time? And you know, sure, you're a great speaker, you're the rabbi, but yeah, just saying. Yeah.
So obviously, when young adults enlist in the IDF, the perception of an American is very vague, and they don't necessarily realize the commitment that and the sacrifice that you're making. Now that you're in your 30s, do Israelis get it in a different way, and do Americans perceive you differently?
Yeah, I would say most Israelis kind of get it, having now been through it themselves, and you know, usually they've served with at least, you know, one other lone soldier. So they certainly, you know, I would say it's far more common that they get it than they don't. Thinking back to like in the beginning when they were 17, yeah, you're right. Like it was kind of more like you've fallen off a plane from like some world that they've never been to or seen. All they know of America is from Animal House, and you know, always ask me like, is college like the movies? You know, but yeah, I think as you grow up, and it's interesting. Like the people that I served with, I didn't have a lot in common with them when they were 18 and I was 22. And I feel like as we've continued to meet every year for reserves, I feel closer and closer to them as our lives kind of converge. You know, the difference between 31 and 34 is not as significant as 18 and 22. So I would say at this point, most of them really get it in a meaningful way.
I think the Americans get it. The other half of the question, do the people here understand what being a lone soldier is really?
It's kind of hard to understand unless you do it. You know, hopefully the book helps a little bit with that. You know, part of the goal was to try to tell a story of what it's like to experience those things. But it's like most things in life, you can be told how it is to do X or Y, but it's never quite the same as actually doing it and experiencing it. So I guess to the extent that I've been successful in conveying what that feels like, maybe Americans can have some idea of what that's like. But no, it's a whole different world. You know, I think Americans sometimes think about Israel as like a Hebrew-speaking version of us, and Israelis are far more similar to their neighbors, I think, than they are to Americans. It's different values, it's a different upbringing, a different culture. So it's really two different worlds. Is that a full answer?
I think it's a full answer.
Can you be honest?
What advice would you give, and do you give, to young non-Israelis who are looking to join the IDF?
I think to get as educated as possible about the commitment that you're making. You know, once you sign up, you can be put anywhere. You can be combat or not combat, and you've signed a contract. And so, you know, just kind of going through all the potential scenarios in your head, understanding that good soldiers are needed everywhere, and even if you don't make it into the top unit, it doesn't make you less important. All these things are easy to kind of hear, and I feel like I have that conversation, and the person's like in their head like, yeah, but that's not going to be me. So, you know, I just try to stress kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. I have a podcast where I interview former lone soldiers, and part of the goal is to talk about those experiences. Frankly, it's fun. it's like an hour and a half flies by. Usually it's my friends that I'm interviewing, and it's like a walk down memory lane, but it also hopefully provides kind of framework for people who want to come and do what we did to understand that, you know, it's not all kind of glorious, and most of it isn't actually. So I think just understanding the whole picture of the commitment that they're making is what I try to stress.
I just walked in, I didn't realize, what's the name of the book?
A line in the sand.
You can start it, the one to start over.
3 years.
How long did you?
3 years.
How much?
3.
Oh, because, my husband, who, he was a tank commander in the Israeli army, he went as a lone soldier
Wow.
long ago, and then my son went, and I'm actually asking my son right now, what did you do? I shot the mag?
Oh yeah, that's the big gun. I had that one too.
I said, because he also, my son went too at 19.
What year did he go?
He was 19, he's 32, can you do the math?
So I would have
It's
20.
about the same.
Yeah, I was gonna say probably 2010. 2000.
Yeah, do the math, because I'm so tired, I'm still.
What's his name?
What's that?
What's his name?
Jake Schreibman, Jake Aaron Schreibman.
I'll look up his picture.
It's the most incredible thing you could do, right?
Yeah, I think so.
It changed my son's life.
No, for sure, 1,000%.
It changed his life. I didn't know him beforehand, so I really don't know
If it changed.
him. He stayed in Israel longer afterwards. My son stayed for a few years, and then just financially, he said, I got
It's
to
hard
go
there,
back
yeah.
and start. He was really starving.
Yeah, it's really hard there, honestly.
Yeah, but he loved it. And,
yeah.
And he became more, I wouldn't say observant, but more of really like being a Jew is like, and the Friday night is his life now. And they used to laugh at me, and he says, he feels bad, he says, oh, I tell my friends that you couldn't get us to stay in on Friday night, and I did, I tried everything, we'll do it earlier, we'll do it later, we'll do, you know, and now, he's the cook, he does it, you know, I can't say that he goes to shul regularly, but he's very,
It becomes a part of your identity, right? Like, it becomes a part of your identity.
So,
Yeah.
so much so,
Yeah.
so much so, it's, I commend you.
Thank you. I mean, tankers have the hardest job, frankly, so.
He was a tank
Yeah.
commander, yeah, and he was quite serious.
Yeah.
Yeah, he went for the,
Well, you know,
Yom
besides,
Kippur War. Was it after the Yom Kippur War, I think? When
Elaine,
they
we're
were-
gonna have the opportunity to buy books downstairs if we,
What's that?
as soon as we finish, we'll have the opportunity to buy some of,
I just
Some
came
Corey's
looking
books
for Dory,
downstairs.
so I fell into a wonderful moment.
I mean, I'm sure many of you all know that besides from Dory, we have 3 former lone soldiers who pray at the shul fairly regularly. Olivia and Gabe and actually Max, who's still there, Max Koffler, who's serving as we speak. So if you want to follow up on any of the things that Corey discussed, we definitely have resources
I'll
around.
send it to my son, he's in Utah.
Yeah.
That's where he wound up, but, I was gonna ask you, where was your family? What family took you in?
Oh, so you know, I did a program called Garin Sabar. Is that what your son did too?
No, he was Chayil Boded and Kibbutz Be'eri
Be'eri.
became
His kind of home
his
base.
family.
So the program that I did basically took the children of expats, or if you'd been in Israel for 6 months, you could slide in. That was how I got into this program. And you meet a couple times in the States, like 10 times over a weekend, and then you move together to a kibbutz in Israel, and you kind of become each other's family there.
Right.
You also have like a adopted family that you go to on weekends and whatnot.
That's it.
But I think for me, because of the age difference, I was one of 3 or 4 college grads out of 30. I gravitated towards kind of people my own age and ended up in a Tel Aviv apartment, probably pretty soon after I drafted. And frankly, the friends that I made who were serving at the same time, but not necessarily in my unit, have really become kind of a family, and we're still in touch to this day. The WhatsApp group is alive for 14 years now. So yeah, it's important to have people in a network that surrounds you, for sure.
Well, my son wound up with the family, the kibbutz that were his adopted
No way.
family.
That's crazy.
So where's
By
family?
coincidence or on purpose?
No, on purpose.
Okay.
When we called them and we said, we gotta do something, my son was definitely going off track a little bit. And they said, send him here.
That's
send him
amazing.
here," And it was amazing.
That's really cool.
So,
2
yeah.
generations that they took in.
What's that?
2 generations that they took in.
It's incredible.
That's
We
awesome.
even actually got it done too.
What? There you go.
Well, I think